Welcome to SpanReads, not your typical rereads podcast, a 17th Shard series where we reread the Cosmere and are giant nerds about it. Today, we will be talking about the magic in Alloy of Law and its interactions with the story. This episode will have spoilers for Alloy of Law and prior books from Era 1. Joining me is Mish.
Hi, I'm Mish, firstRainbowRose.
Also joining me is Ian.
Hey, I'm Rewriter.
And last but not least is Rosemary.
Hello, I'm Kaymyth.
And I am Jessie, and I go by Lady Lameness. Today, let's talk about magic. And let's talk about Scadrian magic and how it's presented in Alloy of Law. But to start us off, I think we need someone to do overcap of how compounding works. And I'm going to nominate Ian to do that.
Yes. So before we get into compounding itself, the three metallic arts are Allomancy, Fruchemy, and Metallurgy. Allomancy, you burn metals and you get power from preservation, and you can do a whole bunch of cool things. Fruchemy, you store your own power, your own investiture into metals that you can later retrieve, converting different attributes. So you can store your strength for a certain amount of time to get stronger later on. And then Metallurgy, you just stab people with metal and stab other people with that metal. And you can transfer attributes, magical abilities, all that fun stuff. Metallurgy is fun. It's not evil at all. It's just power. But the fun thing is when you have where you can use the same metal for both Allomancy and Fruchemy. Because in Fruchemy, you're limited about how much you can put in. It's you can't. So it's you store an hour's worth of strength, and then you can tap it for an hour to become twice as strong, or you can become stronger for a shorter amount of time. But you're still limited by what you can store. However, if you burn a metal mind that you have stored some amount of attribute in, when preservation's investiture is coming to you because you're burning a metal, that's what it does. It gets changed by that attribute, becoming more of that attribute. So instead of burning iron to push on metals, you get more weight that you can then store in metal mines and use at your leisure. And so you only have to store a tiny bit to have nearly endless amounts of your attribute, which is very useful.
But the catch is that you need to have Allomancy and Ferrochemy of the same.
And so in Era 1, the only person we saw with both Allomancy and Fruchemy was the Lord Ruler, and later some of the Steel Inquisitors. However, in Era 2, people have been getting it on between populations. And so the genes for Fruchemy split, and so now we have fairings. So previously, it's if you were a Fruchemist, you had all of the metals. Now there are Fruchemists of only one metal. And now you can be a misting and a fairing, also known as a Twinborn.
And that's when things get fun.
It's a very interesting combinations there.
Interactions of these combinations are just, you could just spend ages coming up with different ways to pair different metal powers together. And, there's a lot of them.
And that's not even touching on the fact that the two god metals, the three metals, even without playing with those, the number of different interactions is fascinating.
Yeah, there are 256 different potential metalborn combinations if you're just using the base 16 with Allomancy and Ferrochemy. Granted, some of those combinations don't do much because, what are you going to do as an aluminum misting other than just go?
Well, I think that depends on what aluminum's ferrochemic power is.
Identity.
Aluminum is weird.
Well, I mean, to be fair, identity. Wayne could if Wayne were to be spiked with identity, could you imagine the ridiculous things that he could, to an extent, when I was reading
the ramifications.
To an extent, when I was reading this, I was already are we sure that Wayne doesn't have a little bit of an idea? Because when he talks about being the old woman, his thoughts, and when he talks about being a cop and stuff, his thoughts change, and his
we have wobs on that though. He's just a really good method actor.
Oh yeah.
It's not. It's not.
But I mean,
it's just Wayne.
But imagining what he could do if he had an identity spike.
That's utterly terrifying. Please don't give him the idea.
And so yes, there's like the 16 compounding options, but those are almost the boring ones where it's like, okay, yeah, like you do awesome things if you have double gold.
You still don't know what copper compounding does.
Yeah, but
wait, what?
We don't really know what it means to compound a memory. Like what does that mean conceptually? But the interesting thing is like when you get to combinations like Wax, where he has two different metals, but they synergize very well. Because it's like steel pushing, it's all about if you push on a piece of metal that weighs less than you, it flies off. If it weighs more than you fly off. But then being able to change your weight, you can control whether you're going to fly off or push the other thing. And that's where you can see Brandon is a magic system nerd. It's like this is the sort of thing that excites him.
Wax scaling Techiel Tower really showcased that and really drove home the point that he is totally cheating at being a coin shot with his ferrochemy. But, you know, it makes sense.
I love how he involves his love of firearms with this as well. And he's like, I need to get back over there in the sky. Well, I'll just weigh nothing and shoot that way and then get pushed that way by the...
Oops, I broke the flagstones. Crap.
Right! Oh, I broke the flagstones. I need to be more careful in the city. Yeah.
And so like the introduction of Fairings and Twinborn, it just gives the magic this entirely different dimension that we didn't have in Era 1, where the magic was really cool in Era 1, and it just got even cooler in Era 2.
You can really dig down then into what people can do with individual powers, because, you know, most of our focus characters in the first era of Mistborn, you know, we had Vin and Elend, who were both Mistborn, at least eventually, and they had everything, and they each had different strengths when it came to using their metals. But when you're Twinborn, you have one of these and one of these, and you are really going to drill down into exactly what you can pull off with what power you have. The fact that in the opening prologue, Wax is using his steel to track for the enemy because he knows they're going to be carrying guns, they're going to be carrying metals, so he turns on his steel and looks to see which lines are moving. So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to use it. And the fact that he just walks around all the time at 3/4 weight.
And, like, has his steel bubble so that people can't directly shoot him.
Oh, the steel bubble.
The steel bubble is an interesting thing because Brandon has, at different points in time, attributed it to different things.
Yeah, he keeps going back and forth over whether he wants Wax to be a savant or not.
Yeah, so like sometimes he attributes it to like being a steel savant, which is like you burn your metals so much that like it physically changes you. Like this is what happened to Spook in Hero of Ages. He became a tin savant. But whenever in the Cosmere you're mixing powers, you get resonances, which is like you have these two powers and together they make this third power. So sometimes he's referred to like Steel Bubble as Wax's resonance. And then sometimes he's like, oh, like the two powers are becoming one for Wax. And like, what does this mean, Brandon? Make up your mind.
Sounds like he's trying to be like cheeky and he actually knows what it is and he's trying to red herring and it's completely something different. I
think a lot of it was he originally went with he's just a steel savant, and then later on backtracked on that because he didn't think that Wax was suffering from enough negative consequences of being a steel savant.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if he had already had the idea of resonances or if it was just a handy way to come up with the idea. I'm still very curious as to what Wayne's resonance is.
I think Wayne is a very interesting alternative to Wax in this case, because Wax's powers synergize really, really well. And Wayne's do to an extent, but not quite as well. Like, it is helpful for him to be able to throw up a cadmium bubble if he's just been shot and needs a bit of time to not die. That is very helpful, but it just doesn't click quite as well as Wax's do.
It's useful in combat, especially the way Wayne fights, because he doesn't use guns. So if you are always taking people on hand to hand, and you're always bringing a dueling cane to a gunfight, being able to pull that person out of continuity with everyone else is a huge advantage.
And I love the scene at the end of Alloy of Law where he's fighting in the big cavern, and Wax makes the comment, it's like, oh, Wayne's just over there doing his thing, like going up and grabbing people. But then there's a little bit later from Wayne's perspective, I think, where he's mostly just trying to distract them and keeps putting up one bubble, moving around inside of it, moving to another place, dropping it, putting up another one, so that they're constantly confused and like still trying to track him, but they're not going to do other things. They're not going after Wax or going after hostages.
Mm-hmm.
So he does use it in a very interesting and cool way that works very well for his fighting style, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and he also traps one person with him while he's moving around. So he levels out the fight of, instead of it being guns everywhere, it's, I'm fighting this one person and they're going to be disoriented while I'm kicking their teeth in.
And Brandon has mentioned in interviews and such that not all of the powers are equally useful in every situation. When we get into certain things that are introduced in Book 3, Bands of Mourning, certain things there are meant to level the playing field a little bit in regards to the spectrum of powers. So it makes sense that not all of the combinations are going to be as synergistic, be as effective together, because that's just how nature works. Like, not everything works super well together.
And
luck of the draw. Just luck of the draw.
Yeah.
You roll the dice.
Yeah.
Those are the two you got.
And even just the single powers, not all of them are useful. Like aluminium is the obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
But to touch back on something that we've talked about in both of our last two episodes is cadmium and Marasai, and how most of her life, her father has been saying like she has this useless allomantic power, to the point that she really internalized that. Yet it was her use of the power that saved the day in the end, and showed that there really was actually a use for this power, even if it wasn't immediately obvious, and even if it's not as useful as Bendeloy, it still has a useful purpose in place.
Yeah, you just need to find that place.
Yeah, and it's great that it's a solution to some of their problems, and it's also a really great cap to Marasi's character arc in the book. Of where she goes through thinking that she's just like this third wheel, not being useful, and in the end, she gets to be the linchpin of the plan, and it's just an awesome arc to see her go through.
Well, and I love the fact that right off the bat, Brandon gives us these two, like literally, it's the opposites of each other. And you get to play with the, oh, well, I speed up time. Oh, well, I slow down time. And he addresses the question of, Wayne's like, I wonder what would happen if we both were in the same place and we both did the thing. And Rossi's like, it does nothing. And Wayne's like, oh, okay, moving on.
We didn't get into the fact, though, that cadmium bubbles and bend alloy bubbles have different size limitations. So you could wind up with, a bend alloy bubble inside a larger cadmium bubble where there's, like if you're in the middle, you're in the same time as everyone outside, but then there's this realm of slow time between you, and I'm sure there are uses for that if you think hard enough.
Well, it's like going back to Era 1, Brennan has always said the means for faster than light travel are built into the magic. And this is where we finally got to see you're meddling with time, of course. And we don't have all of the pieces yet, but it's like we're starting to see those speed bubbles probably involved in some way.
Brandon just told us that just so that he would have the joy of watching us go crazy over it for a couple of decades before he finally told us how it worked. We are his entertainment just as much as he is ours.
I also really enjoy the puzzle, and I know that this came up in one of the other episodes as well, of how to use the magics to defeat someone who is basically immortal, which is what Miles was doing, by compounding gold. And the use of the time bubbles to do that, instead of it just being wax shooting people. Like this was a really innovative solution, I think, to tie back in the magic, and also a magic that we haven't seen at this point, to solve the solution that he presented.
Yeah, and I also like that Brandon didn't make one of the leads a compounder. Like, he made one of the villains a compounder, and making it gold. Like, that is a very scary villain. But Brendan didn't just focus on like the compounding the Firukumi. Like, he did have the gold Allomancy in there as well, because like that's another important part of what makes Miles's character so interesting.
And at the end, when Marasai goes to Miles's execution, is a rather gruesome scene, because they have to get all of the gold off of him and out of him, because he also had it inside his body to actually be able to go through with it, and they couldn't get it all, so they just kind of had to keep going until so that was gruesome to read.
But it's such an image in your head.
Yeah.
Like, the firing squad's like shooting at him and he's not dying.
Yeah. And that's after they've tried. She mentions, they didn't get all of the gold. So that's showing that they've already tried a few different things. On the not as obvious side, I love the earring. I love Wax's. I love how subtle it is. Like, at the time, people knew what it was. Like, I remember people being like, "Oh, that's probably a spike," and the discussion that went around that. So I feel okay in bringing it up, because it's confirmed in a later book, but after this book, we knew that it was a spike. And just the interesting aspect of when Wax is wearing it versus when he isn't, and the fact that he mentions a few times when he's wearing it, he gets a sense of amusement, or he gets like these little flashes. And then, of course, as we've already mentioned, the lovely conversation with Sazet at the end.
And beyond that, if it's a hemological spike, there's something in there. And I think the big theory is that it gives him just a little bit of pewter that he might be pulling directly from the mists, because he always feels stronger in the mists and doesn't feel pain as much.
Yeah. Like the only issue is like it's so small and so degraded. It's like it can't be doing much, but like
it's just like enough to give him that little bit of an edge.
Yeah.
Because it's not really making him noticeably stronger, but he feels better.
I do love, he mentions multiple times, and I love that he mentions multiple times that he feels better in the mist. And, talking about the religions, one of the religions believes that the mists, or he mentions, they say that the mists increase your power, but I don't believe that. I just like the way they feel. And it's amusing that, he mentions so many times that he enjoys the mists.
I kind of wonder, I would just love to make him sit here and do the scientific experiment. Does he feel different in the mists when he has his earring in versus when he has it out?
Yeah.
Because usually if he's out there fighting, he's got his earring in, because you're supposed to wear it whenever you're doing something important. So what if all of his combat experience in the mist is always wearing his earring, and he just doesn't realize that it's related to the earring? Just like it took Vin forever to figure out that her earring was doing stuff.
And Vin's was the same, where it was such a small thing that it was doing, but it was still doing something. So I never actually thought about like what Wax's earring could be. So I'm loving all of this. I'm like, yeah, this sounds great. I love it. I agree with all of it.
Talk about the fact that Wax, at least some of the time, uses his allomancy in conjunction with his guns. I mean, we had the thing at the end where he fired the gun and then steel pushed it, but there's a point where Miles mentions that that Wax is the most accurate shooter he's ever seen, where it says that Wax seemed to have an inborn instinct for firearms. Miles had seen him make shots he'd have sworn were impossible. And how much of that is Wax helping to guide the bullet with a steel push?
Well, I mean, there's that wonderful shot at the end, which I think you were referring to, where he's like, I can't risk shooting her in the head. So he shoots out of the bubble, knowing for a fact that it's just going to randomly go somewhere. And then he has Wayne drop the bubble, and he has enough of a precision shot to be able to shoot a second bullet in the trajectory needed to then push that bullet and use that bullet to nudge the first one around which is, I mean, it's just insane.
Yeah, like that was an insane
and some of
shot.
that is, some of that is him maybe actively using Allomancy. Some of it may be the way he can track things. But I mean, it's hard for him to catch a bullet if he's not expecting it. But if he's already engaged,
yeah,
I don't know, it makes me think that a steel compounder could do some scary things just with their Allomancy.
Yeah,
because
Brandon has mentioned that like any amount of investiture like will affect your mind. It's when you burn atium, it's like your mind expands to allow you to use that power. So using the power that allows you to push on metals has probably altered his mind in a way that is very effective for firearms.
Well, and I love how aluminum comes into play so much in this book. And like, it's not an interactive. So trying to work around the fact that just the way that the metals guns, because, you know, you've got guns that are are inert. You've got bullets that are inert. And then you've got Renette and Vindication. And the fact that there's a allomantic specific safety, and there's an allomantic way to ensure that these there's these special rounds. Like, it's fascinating to see how allomancy interacts with guns.
And how Renette's creating the different types of bullets as well.
Scadrial is the Earth analog for the Cosmere. And it's moments like this where you realize, like, oh, okay, this is why Brennan chose the metal magic as the Earth analog. Is because there is so much metal in our culture, especially with guns. Like, guns on Roshar, like, it wouldn't be as cool.
Yeah.
In the same way.
And just for a little background for those watching who might not necessarily know, aluminum being expensive is actually historically accurate to our timeline. Back up until like the mid 1800s, aluminum was more valuable than gold on our world because of how difficult it was to make. And it was the invention of what became known as the Hall-Héroult process, where they used electrolysis to purify aluminum, is what made it super cheap. And Scadrial has electricity. They are this close to cracking Hall-Héroult, which means by the time we get to Era 3, aluminum is going to be cheap, and everyone is going to have it. And it's going to be a game changer when it comes to how people deal with allomancy.
I mean, there's already that tinfoil. They mentioned the tinfoil hat.
Yeah, tinfoil hats.
Like,
I don't remember if that's in this book or the next book, but when he did it,
it's in this book.
It wasn't in this book.
Yeah,
and it's like, and it wasn't something Brennan intended on doing. It's like he realized retroactively, like, oh, like I made aluminum foil hats actually a thing in the Cosmere because that's how things work.
And it makes sense.
That protects you from emotional allomancy. Like,
but it doesn't necessarily have to be a solid barrier. Imagine once aluminum becomes cheap, every lady can have fancy aluminum jewelry in their hair that protects them from allomancy. They can have like little chains and things, you know, like you go to the Renaissance Festival and you get the little headdresses made out of chainmail.
Yeah.
And
pretty sure that this is aluminum, my little headband here. And
it's probably aluminum alloy rather than pure aluminum. There's not very many aluminum alloys that will actually act the same way as pure aluminum does.
That's a question, though.
But I've made chainmail out of aluminum links, and it's really easy to work and really easy to to make into things. So people can just order little strips of aluminum with a couple pairs of pliers. All they have to do is wrap it around a dowel and snap them all off, and they can make their own stuff. So once aluminum is cheap in this world, everything changes.
And like there has to be an aluminium alloy in Scadrial that is still doing the same thing, because that's what Wax is trying to figure out for the guns, because they couldn't use pure aluminium for it. It has to be alloyed with something, but whatever it's alloyed with isn't actually stopping the effect.
Yeah, it's still close enough to aluminum realmatically that it has the same investiture neutralizing effect.
It's probably got a very small addition of other substances to it.
Yeah.
It's probably a primarily aluminum. I do kind of wonder about Invarian steel, because they talk about Vindication being stronger and lighter than your average gun, and I kind of wonder if that's maybe like a steel titanium alloy, because titanium is a lot lighter, and you can alloy with it with steel, I think, if I remember correctly. So I bet that's probably what he's going for there, or if he wasn't specifically, it would be a good explanation for it. Because they're getting to the point where they can start working with those kinds of metals.
Yeah, because Brandon has said, like, yes, it's the Earth analog, but things don't progress at the exact same speed as Earth. And so that they are way more advanced in metallurgy than Earth was at the same time.
Which makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are only just discovering cars and like electricity. So
we don't have radio yet.
Yeah.
We apparently don't have it. If there are telegraphs, they are not yet in wide use.
Radio waves.
And if you look at the size of the Ellendale Basin, it's not that big.
No.
The whole basin could fit inside the state of Texas. So when you're talking about a train ride, they're talking about how far away the roughs are. I mean, you could make that train ride in a day, even with the slow trains, the slower trains of like the early 1800s or mid 1800s. So it shouldn't really be that difficult to travel.
Yeah, like you can actually, if you take the Final Empire map and the Ellendale Basin map, like you can see the overlap. Like you can, the peninsula is very distinctive.
Yeah.
And it's like the Ellendale Basin compared to the Final Empire is not that big. So there's a lot out there.
Well, thank you for joining me, guys, and thank you for watching, everybody. You can find us at 17shard.com for all your news, discussion, theories, and fun that you could ever want. You could find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud. Leave us a review on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, and also support us on Patreon. See you next time, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.